how those policies are taking effect. One idea that might be worth considering is to actually tax some of the windfall from lower oil prices in countries that actually import all their oil. And then those tax revenues could be used for targeted support to affected people and businesses. And on the social policies front, from a macroeconomic perspective, we just like to emphasize that these policies should be highly targeted and temporary. Given a limited fiscal space, escape clauses for post-crisis phase are actually really important to put in there. So we can send around a PowerPoint later, but we're tracking all these different policies that different countries are undertaking and seeing what's working. Each country has its own constraints and limitations, whether it's fiscal space or other factors. But we'll be glad to share that with you and use that as part of our dialogue with both governments and stakeholders moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Therese, I'd like to go to you next. Given what David has outlined and all of these different ways in which coronavirus has the potential to hamper Caribbean economies, what are the options for governments at this time? What can they do to ensure that we survive and have the possibility of thriving in the future?
Thanks, Walter. And let me just say that I'm really impressed that over 515 people, now up to 518 people, are joining this webinar, which speaks volumes about not just your interest in our region, but also the advice that the IDB can provide and a bit of support at this time. Every government in this region and around the world, Golda, are facing that exact question. Our role as a multilateral institution that's been in this region for over 50 years is really to provide as much support as possible. And I say that with the biggest of intention and the biggest of heart, because we've been working across this region for a very long time. So governments know that in a crunch, they can come to us to look for support. Now, what does that look like? David just described what is a ridiculous scenario in terms of economic shocks that Latin America and the Caribbean facing right now. To say that this is probably the biggest challenge is, of course, an understatement, and we've heard that throughout the world since day one. What we have been doing and what we have offered to all the governments in the region, from the Bahamas all the way down to Suriname, and I'm talking about from Argentina all the way to Ecuador and Chile in the bank's members, is to say, first of all, we have already an existing portfolio with each country. And to the extent possible, we would like to redirect some of those resources, first of all, to deal with the health crisis, because as you know, many countries in this region in particular have very weak health infrastructure. So that's one line of work. It's not just dealing with how to prevent a spread of the virus, but also how to shore up the hospitals, how to shore up the professionals, how to shore up the need for equipment and so on. So that's really important. Second line of defense is, of course, can we redirect resources to help on the fiscal side to make it easier for the vulnerable. So people who are unemployed or will be unemployed as a result of this crisis. Already, as David mentioned, most of the hotels in the Caribbean are closed. The extent to which some countries have unemployment insurance may help, but many don't. So the extent to which we can help governments think through what are those ways in which we can provide some cash transfers for that sector. Third, on the small, medium enterprise sector, and James will come on later and talk about what we can do about corporates, but imagine you're a small business in the Caribbean. For the most part, your organization is going to be badly hit because economic activities come to a grinding halt throughout the region. So how do we make sure that at the end of this, those entities are still in some sort of position to survive? And that would mean providing, whether it's credit guarantees or through development banks or through the commercial banks where we have relationships already to provide these credit guarantees, but also to give those small, medium enterprises some advice about how to go about dealing with this crisis. this is also a moment for all governments in the Caribbean to take a look at how we do business and how we deliver services to the general public. For those of you who have been working with me for the last 3 years as general manager for this region, one of the big themes that we've been emphasizing is how to get our countries to move to digital platforms sooner rather than later. We all know we're facing that today, where the IDB itself, the entire organization, is working from home. Lots of private companies in Jamaica, where I live, have sent people to work from home. But we know that many public entities don't have that facility because we're not ready for it. So here are opportunities for companies who work in the digital field, who do offer computer services, who can help institutions deal with this. Here is an opportunity to help those businesses become more modern and to use digital platforms. I want to say that one area that concerns me a lot is what's happening with education, because we know that there are some schools, obviously, that can provide online learning very quickly and easily. But imagine there are public schools all over, and I use Jamaica as an example because it's probably a good one and it's where I live. There are parts of this country where some schools do not have online learning. Children don't have tablets, they don't have access to data. Their homes aren't equipped with internet access. And so I worry about those children who don't have access to education at this time. Luckily, we're in a period where generally there's a break, whether it's spring break or Easter break, so kids are home. But it gives us an idea to think about, are there other ways in which we can be delivering educational services to our children across this region? Many people are talking about the fact that post-COVID-19, we're not going to be doing things the way we did them before. And I think that's a really good platform to start thinking about whenever this day comes, what are our economies, what are our societies, what are our institutions, what are our schools going to look like, and what are our social spaces going to look like. I'm going to stop here because I think James can really share what the private sector is doing. And by the way, I just want to put in a plug for IDB Lab, which is a part of our organization that really looks very in a forward-looking way at solutions that can be provided through technology. We've had this challenge for companies, individuals to come up with ideas around how to solve some of this COVID-19, these problems in the region. We got lots of applications and proposals to look at, and over the coming days, those proposals are going to be analyzed. I want to say that as far as I'm concerned, the bank has really reached out, and we've also had a lot of people reaching into us. So that is a very good place to be in as an institution. So I'm going to stop and turn it over to James. Thank you.
Thanks, Therese. James, all across the region, private sector businesses are grappling to come to terms with what they should do to remain profitable now. And also, what opportunities has this crisis given to us, and how can we take full advantage of them? James?
Great, thanks. Golda, do you hear me well?
I hear you perfectly well.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much to Therese, for organizing this. I see we're over 500 participants. It shows how important this is for the region and for the group. I'd like to try and help answer 3 questions. Who we are, what we do, and how can we help? Who we are, as Therese said, we're the IDB Group. Within the IDB Group, we have a number of clients. Some of them are governments, but many of those are private sector clients. And IDB Invest, the institution which I work in, is an institution that is dedicated to finance or provide services to the private sector for development purposes. As you know, improving lives is the reason for existence of the IDB Group, and we do it through working through the private sector. What do? We're a commercial bank in a sense that we lend money, we provide guarantees, and we give advice. So think of us that we're a consulting firm and a bank that provides both advice and money to be able to work to improve lives. How can we help? And I wanted to bring it closer to the Caribbean. One is, we're an institution that has decided many years ago to give top priority to the Caribbean countries. And as such, we've developed a strategy to be much closer to our clients. We've created a hub in Kingston, Jamaica, and have people physically in all the countries of the Caribbean in which we work in. Obviously, before it was in an office, now it's in each of our houses. Second, we've developed the technical expertise to understand the number of sectors that are critically important to the Caribbean. So a few examples. Tourism sector. If I look back 3-4 years ago, it's a sector we did not know much about. And now it's a very fast growing sector for us, in particular in Central America and the Caribbean. Second, agribusiness. So important to replace imports in the Caribbean. That's a sector we've developed expertise and expanded our portfolio from 0% to nearly 10% of our portfolio in the agribusiness sector. So I can go on in specific sectors we develop, but let me bring it back to the Caribbean. As David and Therese were naming, the Caribbean will be affected in very specific areas, not only as many other countries in the economic impact and growth stories that all these countries will have, but the Caribbean countries are highly dependent on specific sectors. That varies by country, but a common theme in the Caribbean is tourism is a large employer of SMEs and individuals throughout the Caribbean. Second, agribusiness, manufacturing, supply chains, connecting the Caribbean to the rest of the world to import. So what we've developed internally is a strategy to, one, help our clients. We have across the region over 300 clients, in the Caribbean over 30 clients, which we plan to give specific facilities to be able to cope with the crisis that they're dealing with. Second, we've got $5 billion available to help mitigate the economic impact of this crisis throughout the region. It's not earmarked only to the region, but at least $500 million of business of that will be earmarked and to the Caribbean. In addition to that, we are creating a very specific facility that is going to be approved at the board in the next 10 days to earmark specific areas that are directly impacted in the crisis. And I'm talking about the health sector, I'm talking about the education sector, I'm talking about the pharma sector, the sectors that can help address the current crisis that is going through, the health crisis that humanitarians are going through. So to sum up, we're a bank that for development purposes can lend to most of the countries that are connected today. Second, we have a very long-term view of development, and as such are not worried or scared about the economic cycles that we're all living through. We have a big counter-cyclical role. So this is a time where these institutions step up to invest more rather than less. Areas that we will be looking for very closely is work on the trade sector, where we understand many of the trade partners that are connecting with the Caribbean are backing away. Supply chains, as we know, the Caribbean is very connected to the rest of the world through global supply chains, and many of those are cutting down. So we're going to work directly with that. Through financial institutions, address lack of financial services to SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. So working with a number of financial institutions in the region to be able to channel money through them to continue to lend to the SME sector. We've got specific lines to protect some sectors as tourism, agribusiness, and manufacturing, and specific funds to help enhance sectors that, as Therese was referring to, are going to be part of the solution. And in that group, I put the telecom business, the fintech business, the e-education sector, the health sector. And last but not least, as I said, a very specific sector that we're addressing is expertise that we have as a group to help mitigate the health crisis that we're all going through. Not forgetting the crisis that constantly affects the Caribbean and most of our countries is a climate crisis. And as such, those are areas that we have committed globally to continue to work very closely with governments and the private sector to address, and a number of other subsectors. And I'm happy both Therese, Gold, and David to address any questions. So I just wanted to again reiterate who we are, what we do, and how can we help. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you also, Therese and David. So as both of you mentioned, we have quite a maximum capacity audience this morning, and already there are a lot of questions for us to answer. So I'd like for us to get into as many of those questions as possible in the hour that we have. And I think, David, this question is directed to you, but also Therese and James, you can interject at any point in time. Kayleigh asks, do you anticipate a V-shaped recovery? Or given the high dependency on tourism and the likely reticence of people to travel, do you think that the region is in for a longer slog?
Well, naturally, that really depends upon the global health response, first and foremost, right? People won't be able to travel until we get the health situation under control. The key thing for having a V-shaped recovery, I think, is the following. You know, I saw a statement by Minister Turnbull Deputy Prime Minister Turnbull of the Bahamas the other day to Parliament, where he mentioned that, you know, they're used to hurricanes as a disaster. At least with a health disaster, you keep your physical infrastructure intact. So let's look on the bright side there. You still have your buildings and your hotels and all of that. But you also need to have the people to work there. So you need to maintain the health of your people and the human capital that can go back to work. But finally, you need to maintain the market institutions for all of that to come together. That's something that James understands much better than I. And so the key thing there will be, are there measures in place to make sure that these market institutions survive the downturn? You know, so do you have some measures that will keep businesses afloat, and even, you know, take advantage of this opportunity to maybe retrain some of the workers that are not currently employed. They can't do their normal activities in the tourism sector because it's shut down. So on the global scale, you need the health response to be effective enough that people feel safe enough to travel again. And then on the national or local level, you need to protect your people and protect your market institutions to be ready for a possible recovery.
Thanks, David. Reese is asking a question which is related. Given the significant importance of tourism in the Caribbean, what would post-COVID-19 phased ramp up of tourism look like? Is this a wake-up call to do things differently? Therese?
Yeah, shall I jump in on that one? Super good question. Sorry, there's a truck passing, just one sec. So, yeah, okay. As David just mentioned, and as DPM Turnquest, by the way, David, you gave him a new name.
Oh, sorry.
DPM Turnquest in the Bahamas, sure, we'll still have the infrastructure. But I think Reese's question really is worth a lot of reflection, because tourism as we know it will probably be quite different. I agree, everybody's going to be jittery post-COVID-19. I mean, I see the cruise business taking a longer time to recover, but we need to figure out two ways in which Caribbean tourism can really extract more value added. What do I mean by that? You know, the business is very much dominated by big multinational hotel chains, with few exceptions. I mean, Jamaica has at least a couple of locally owned hotel chains, but they're also large and global in size. I'm thinking about Sandals, for example. But other than that, we're very much, you know, locked in to international tourism. And the owners of those hotel chains tend to be not in our region. So the extent to which Spain, for example, which is a big Spanish players are very big investors in Jamaican tourism, Spain has been badly hit. I mean, one would think that in the recovery in Spain, that those hotels are going to get the attention first. But I think we're probably looking at a much longer period to get to that V shape that you're asking about, because even since the 2008 recession, our region is pretty much just sort of climbing out of that. And this is 2020. So it's taken us a long time to catch some air, really fuel our economies again, and now we're hit with another whammy. James touched on something very important, which is climate change. And climate change is another dimension that's running throughout not just tourism, but every aspect of our existence and how we do business. So I think, again, we have a crisis that's presenting itself with innumerable ways to reflect and think about doing things differently, and we really have to take this seriously. It's not going to be business as usual.
Thanks, Therese. Another question, there's a dire need for medical equipment and materials. This is an opportunity for private firms to participate in mitigating the spread of COVID-19 by increasing production or repurposing factories to attend to the needs of our populations, producing masks, sanitizers, among other things. Should governments be engaging the private sector in these efforts? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you want to take it? I can complement after.
Yeah, James can add here, but I think governments are already doing that. I see that happening here in Jamaica, for example. And I must say, because all hands are on deck, because the private sector has seized on the fact that if they don't engage in the recovery, their own recovery in the future is going to be much more difficult. They are stepping forward. Now, not every company is in a position to do that, but we've seen where, for example, Appleton Rum has taken it upon themselves to produce sanitizers for the government. So we're seeing that kind of response, and I think that's entirely appropriate. James?
Yeah, I would add the following. One, the humanitarian crisis that we're going through, the responsibility of helping us come out of it is not only in the hands of government. It is in particular in the hands of the private sector. And we as a group are in close contact through the health sector with a number of countries that have been dealing with this for many, many months more than us, particularly the Asian countries. And we're in very close contact to flexibilize those value chains for those solutions, either mass, respiratory system, you name it, to be channeled to the region. And that's part of the work that Therese is doing through the governments to be able to do that. How we can help through the private sector, that facility that I referred to is earmarked to this, is helping the supply, either adapting hotels for them to become intensive care units, expanding intensive care units in hospitals, accessing supply chains for vital materials, foods, and everything to be able to, that value chain to not be done. So my clear answer, as together with Therese, we want to be part of the solution. If you have ideas, please channel them through us. But I think it's important to know that we're going to be putting our money where our mouth is.
Thank you so much, Therese and James. Now, the questions are really coming fast and furious here, and we're trying to run through them as quickly as possible just to give everyone a chance to contribute. One, Anne-Marie is asking, Amani, that should be, some on the ground in St. Lucia are saying that public health decisions must be tempered or take into account an attempt to preserve economic activity. This comes amidst the context of scaled back business operations, leaving essential services in operation. What are your thoughts on how this may be balanced?
David, you want to take that? I mean, is the question, should we be focusing more on health and less on the economy, or the other way around? I'm not sure I got the full round of that question, Boulder.
The question is basically what are your thoughts on how we can balance, economies can balance maintaining a level of economic activity against public health concerns? How do we keep people safe and still have an economy running?
That is extremely difficult. First of all, if people aren't healthy, there'll be no economy anyway. I think it's really important that we put in place whatever measures are necessary to stem the transmission. So some countries have put in, like the Bahamas and Barbados, curfews. Jamaica hasn't put in a curfew yet, but they are strongly encouraging people to stay home. There's a Jamaican expression, I can't get it because I don't have a very good Jamaican accent, and my family will laugh at me if I try to say it in Jamaican patois. But people, stay home, stay home, stay home, stay home. Just limit the amount of movement because, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have robust health infrastructure in this region. So we don't have enough ICU beds, for example. We don't have enough ventilators. We don't have enough PPE equipment for every nurse and doctor. So the extent to which we, as individuals, can be responsible and not make it worse for the authorities, I think is a very important point. Economic activity, I mean, in Jamaica, for example, it's basically the pharmacies and the supermarkets that are open. Everything else is pretty much shut down. Some banks have some services, but the extent to which you can do things from home, you're encouraged to do that. I think we all want to be sensible about this, but this is not business as usual. I know people want to go to the beach, people want to go to a restaurant. Restaurants are closed in Jamaica, there's nowhere to go, you can order takeout. We have to be careful. I think that's more important.
Thanks. We have quite a few questions about the readiness of countries in the Caribbean to operate in a virtual space. Many have already made the switch, as we have, as you mentioned before, to a virtual environment, working from home, going to school online. But in the Caribbean, there are still countries without deep internet penetration, and also there are businesses that are just not equipped, even in the public sector, not equipped to send people home to work from home. What lessons can be derived from this? Anybody want to comment on that? Quite a few questions about our readiness to operate in this new space.
Unfortunately, Golda, I think this person asking the question is hitting the nail on the head. We're not nearly as ready as we ought to be, despite mobile phone penetration throughout this region, which is quite high. A lot of these mobile devices aren't really smart devices, and people don't have access to data at home. So we have mobile devices, millions of them in this region, but we don't have devices and we don't have the means for communicating with services in the way that people can in other countries, even countries of our size, where I think there's much more digital use. So accessing public services over the internet, that's just not something that's very common in the Caribbean. A lot of tax offices have now allowed filing taxes online for obvious reasons. It's important for the government to collect its revenue as efficiently as possible. But there are a lot of ways in which we still love doing business the old-fashioned way. Just think about the number of people who line up to go into a bank to make a deposit or to withdraw cash. For whatever reason, Caribbean people still don't trust internet transactions when it comes to fintech. So I think a lot of post-COVID-19, we're going to see where we're relying more on those kinds of services, because the financial sector will have to put these platforms in place and make them accessible to every single account holder in a more user-friendly way. And I noticed some of them already rolling out new apps to access financial services. But I would say, if I were to grade the region on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of our readiness, we're barely a 5.
James, can you comment on whether there is a role for the private sector to play in bridging this gap in the digital divide, and helping us to be more prepared to work in a new virtual space?
The answer is yes. while one of the big characteristics that the Caribbean has is a very spread out territory. Islands, populations are very far away. And regardless of the current crisis we're living through, technology is a big part of that solution. I've seen it in other parts of the world. And that's why we did put a big focus on working with governments to work through their big telecom companies, but also with privately held companies. An example of that is in the Bahamas. We work with Aliv to expand their impact and territories. And when we saw the hurricane pass through, it was the only form of communication with many of those islands. So as much as we can, we'll continue to help these telecom companies build towers, raise towers to be able to help connectivity. In addition to that, we've been working with many of the large telecoms in the world, particularly with Telefonica, that has a strong presence across the region, to be able to finance smartphones. As Therese was saying, a lot of people in the Caribbean have phones, but are not smartphones. And as such, we provided financing to these large institutions to be able to constantly, at a cheaper rate, sell those smartphones to the population. So the answer is yes, through telecom companies directly for towers and physical infrastructure, and second, directly to the end users through smartphone financings.
David, I think this is a question that you may be able to answer from Christopher, who says, given that supply chains are being broken, manufacturing in many sectors is going to be affected. What are the key sectors you believe island nations should focus on going forward?
In manufacturing per se, I mean, you know, I'm not quite sure what to say there. I noticed there was also another question about supply chains and whether, you know, post-COVID, there will be less regional integration or less supply chains in the future. My own view actually is it'll probably be the other way around. I think we've kind of learned from this experience, despite some protectionist impulses, even in some very large, rich countries in the world. This has taught us just how interconnected we are. And there isn't really a substitute for that. And so it's going to be back to trying to link into those supply chains once again. And maybe, again, you know, thinking through different ways that we can get more value added out of traditional sectors like tourism, new ways of approaching tourism, and also maybe on the production side, also, again, linked to tourism, more agricultural production. James was referring to that earlier. That can really be, so you can be less dependent on imported foodstuffs, for example, for the tourism sector.
We also have quite a few questions about the orange economy, the creative economy, and other non-traditional sectors, which the questions are, what can the Caribbean do looking forward to become less dependent on tourism? And let me just highlight one question from Tristan, who says, which sector should we be looking towards in stimulating development and diversifying from our over-reliance on tourism? Should agribusiness development be ramped up in the context of food and nutrition security, reducing food imports and stimulating competitiveness in the manufacturing sector and intra-extra regional trade? So a lot of people are asking about options away from tourism in agriculture and also in the creative economy. Thoughts?
No, I think that's great, because also all those suggestions for diversification is not trying to jump to something completely different, right? These are areas that are already there and that can be linked to traditional sectors like tourism and get more value for money out of that sector. The creative economy, again, can be part of what these countries offer when people come to visit, or if they try to relocate, say, a service-oriented business, whether it's business process outsourcing, other types of global services, is that, you know, you have some of the same factors that make these locations really, really attractive for tourists can also make it really attractive for business services. And again, getting the basics right, like Therese was mentioning earlier, you know, having all the digital infrastructure in place and all these sorts of things will be critical for some of those new sectors as well. On the creative side, I noticed one of the comments of this is something that's close to my heart because I have a lot of musician friends, but it really is difficult. I mean, even the most famous musicians in the world now make more of their money from live performances than they do from recordings because, I mean, from an economic point of view, property rights have basically been destroyed for recorded music because everyone can get it for free. You know, you go to YouTube and there's all this music for free and no one pays for it anymore. So, I mean, there's GoFundMe and the other options for, and especially, and hopefully some of these social media things like GoFundMe can help some musicians and artists survive during the downswing that we're suffering from right now.
I can add a few thoughts to this. So one, as of today, 8 o'clock at night, the state of Maryland and where I live is going to total lockdown. And in the communication that came out, basically the governor said, you can only go to the supermarket and to the pharmacy. I'm saying this because agribusiness and the supply chain of agribusiness is going to be fundamental during this crisis. And I do think that as it's going to happen also in the Caribbean, it's going to be extremely important if you go through rougher times in which you're going through now, is that supply chain not be cut. Let me tie that to the orange economy. And maybe I'm already going through my second or nearly third week of home working, but I think it's important that we understand that this is not going to only be a financial and economic crisis. It's also going to be a health crisis, a mental health crisis. People are not used to what we're going through, be confined to their own houses day and night in total lockdown period. So I do think that the psychological and mental health issues are going to rise. And for all intents and purposes, I think the Caribbean can play a big healing role to the world, specifically through tourism. And if I may, without creating competition among islands of the Caribbean, reggae music is going to play a big role in putting a smile on people. So trust me, if you look at all the videos that are going around, there's a song sang in reggae music of staying home, that it's a beautiful sound and it brings smiles to people. So I would not underestimate the importance of a smile, happy music in the context of what we're going through. And I do think that the Caribbean has a big competitive advantage there.
If I may, Golda, just chime in a little bit on the creative economy and the orange economy. I think, you know, James hit the nail on the head, right? How are we adjusting in this environment? We're watching lots of movies on Netflix or Prime Video. We are listening to music, whether it's streaming over satellite TV or radio. Imagine, and I've actually seen, was it Saturday night in Jamaica, there was a live online concert. I don't know which artists were there, but I mean, that's the kind of content that would, you know, lift everybody's spirits, as James is saying. So here again, to pick up on David's point, I mean, musicians are going to be hard hit because people like Chronix and Protege and all these great people don't have the advantage of now being able to travel and do their tours and have live audiences, but we can bring them together in some kind of online setting now. I don't know how you make money that way, but I'm sure someone can figure it out. But you know, the human mind is an amazing organ in that we're not short of ideas. And when push comes to shove, we come up with some really brilliant ways of looking at the world. And I think that's what's going to happen in this crisis, because as human beings, we need the human connection. I mean, the same way we feel better off being able to see you in a webinar setting as opposed to not seeing each other, right? Or not hearing each other's voices. I mean, there's a need for that because there's something about us that wants that. So I think there are lots of opportunities for creative people to do things. I mean, I'm seeing, for example, designers in Jamaica come up with all kinds of masks that they're designing. And, you know, every time I open the newspaper, there's another one. These aren't medical N95 masks, but, you know, they're masks for fashion, but, you know, maybe you can put something inside and make it a safety mask as well. So I think people are coming up with new ideas and new ways of doing things, and we just have to cultivate that.
Thanks, Therese. Just one question about how we can support countries who are experiencing a high influx of migrants and refugees amidst COVID-19, and what specific programs or funding is available for migrants and refugees, for programs to support them?
That's such an important question. Everyone on this call probably knows that our region has been hard hit because of the Venezuelan crisis. Guyana, Suriname, Ecuador, Colombia, these countries, not to mention the Bahamas is always a stop-off point for migrants from Haiti. So that's been a constant in this region. So, you know, the bank does have a migration fund that we put in place in response to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and looking at this. So there are some resources to deal with that. I think that the big policy response for governments has to be, you cannot just treat your own citizens. So the extent to which there are migrants in the population who have been exposed, they also need to have access to treatment. And I must say, I've seen some very good policies coming out of the Bahamas, for example, on this, as well as the way the Guyanese are treating with Venezuelan migrants. So yes, there are resources for that.
And an interesting question from one of our attendees. She's asking how are development finance institutions, international development finance institutions, and other organizations cooperating in this time to help the people of the Caribbean?
So because we're few, meaning the IDB is the biggest multilateral partner for Caribbean countries, period, hands down. There's no other doing what we're doing in terms of volume of financing, as well as presence on the ground and policy advice. The World Bank has presence in a few countries. Jamaica happens to be one. Jamaica has a representative who's also responsible for Guyana. We are definitely talking, and we are coordinating to the extent that we are allowed to, meaning between the World Bank and the IDB, for example, we have frameworks that we can work together on financing arrangements. And yesterday, in the context of Trinidad, I had a question from the World Bank about, can we work together on this request from Trinidad? So yes, I mean, it only makes sense because, first of all, we're few. The countries are small, their capacity is constrained, and rather than have many different organizations tripping over each other, it's much better to collaborate. I must say that here in Jamaica, I'm very proud to be part of we're called the IDB Group, International Development Partners. We meet regularly. In fact, after this webinar, I'm in a call with them to talk about what we're doing and what requests we've gotten from the Jamaican government. So I think it's a good example of international cooperation and partnership, but that's basically out of necessity. We don't have the luxury of being able to compete against each other or to overlap in some areas. That's just not an option in the Caribbean.
Let me add a few thoughts to what Therese is saying. We regularly meet every morning with the president of the IDB Group to go through a number of areas in what we call an emergency committee. And as part of that, we constantly review what other multilaterals are doing and how we're collaborating together. When it comes to the Caribbean and when it comes to the private sector, the Caribbean Development Bank, IFC of the World Bank, and CAF are a big important player. And we are working very closely together, and by all means, for one specific reason. The problem is so big that we need to collaborate. There's no reason why, and we should not be competing, on the contrary. So only by adding all our resources, solutions could be more tailor-made to the regions.
Thanks, James. We only have a couple more minutes left, and I wanted to close by asking you all three a question that we have from one of our viewers that I find to be extremely interesting. The question is, what would be your one word of advice or your one word of hope to the Caribbean people facing this pandemic at this time? The road ahead looks long and scary, difficult, and already a lot of people are feeling the crunch. What's your one word of hope and advice. David, I'm going to start with you.
Save the people.
Thanks, David. Therese.
I think mine would have to be courage, because as we've all said in this meeting this morning, this is completely a black swan event. We didn't see it coming. No one saw it coming. It's affecting every single person on the planet. And we have to muster up courage, first of all, to do the right thing, to be disciplined about our own behavior, to come up with good responses, especially for people who are absolutely desperate and need our help. And so that's the word to me that comes to mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Therese. James.
You gave me a big responsibility to go last. Look, this crisis is a time to press a reset button. And while it is a humanitarian crisis and we all need the courage and the hope to save lives and get through it, we are seeing the emergence of a more humble human being through this crisis. And my hope is that when we get through this, we remember that we can live in a different way, that we can use less nature to be able to survive, that we can treat each other much better and not fight and disagree on things that today seem so trivial. So my hope is that when we get through this, not if we get through this, is when we get through this, we remember how humble we are with nature and how human we need to be as a society.
Thank you, James. And thank you all. Thank you, David. Thank you, Therese. Thank you, James, for taking the time to answer some questions from the people that we serve in the Caribbean region. I just want to remind those of you who are watching that we will be sharing David's PowerPoint presentation for those of you who'd like to go a little bit more in depth. We'll also share this video within the next day so that you can review it and share it as well as many times as you like. We're also sharing many of our resources, the research that the department is doing, the publications. We have our Caribbean Dev Trends blog. You just search Caribbean Dev Trends and you'll find us there, which is updated quite frequently. And also follow us on social media. We would like to be here providing information and having conversations like this in this time. So please stay tuned because we'll be doing more of this and joining you in your homes in this new space that we're working in. Thank you so much. Many of you did not get to enter the webinar, but we'll try to make more space in the coming days, right? Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.